All right, it's finally time we had the talk. What talk, you might ask? I mean, who am I kidding? We all know why we're here. Even if you hadn't already seen the title or thumbnail to this video, it seems to be the only thing anybody wants to talk about when it comes to the Kraken. Not the fact that they're off to an 8-5-3 start, which is much better than anybody expected coming into the season, or that they're finally getting great goaltending and from Martin Jones of all people, and not to mention that, but playing suffocating defense in front of him. A complete 180 from how last season started. Nope, in spite of all those things going well for the Kraken, all anybody really wants to focus on is what the heck they're doing with Shane Wright. What's cracking, everybody? And right out of the gate, yes, I know there's probably a good number of you who are wondering how it took me this long to get to the Shane Wright situation with its own separate video. And while there are a couple of reasons, certainly the biggest of which, to be blunt, is just that I don't think this is as big of an issue as a lot of people are making it out to be. Yeah, I probably could have gotten a whole bunch more views and subscribers to the channel if I had just come on here a few games into the season after you've been scratched a couple of times and ranted and raved all Skip Bayless-like about how the Kraken were ruining Shane Wright and Hackstall needs to be fired and Ron Francis needs to be fired and the Kraken just need to completely start over after completely screwing up this whole thing. And I won't lie, at times the Skip Bayless approach does seem pretty tempting. Again, I'd probably drive way more attention to the channel, which would be kind of nice. Plus, I'd have to do way less work to get there, as far as things like planning, research, and certainly critical thinking are concerned. Not to mention the fact I'd only have to know about as much about sports as your average drunk Cowboys bandwagoner in the corner of the bar. Maybe even less. But, well, from a fan perspective, I do think it's fair to have hot takes like that born out of frustration and anger, to then try to produce content like that you pass off as something you've actually spent time, effort, and thought on from an expert point of view. That seems lazy and dishonest to me, and I'm not necessarily trying to say I'm an expert by any means. I try to put a little bit more effort into the content I provide for you guys. Whether or not it comes off that way or actually seems like I do, that's for you to decide, but it didn't seem fair to me or honest to come into this with that fire and brimstone route, just going hot takes and scorched earth fire everybody involved for the way Shane Wright has been handled. Just to get caught up real quick, for those that are somehow not already aware, Shane Wright was the 4th overall pick in this last year's NHL draft by the Seattle Kraken, and a guy who at this time last year was a consensus 1st overall going in, though he does end up sliding to that 4th spot. And since then, although it seemed like he was going to be ready for the NHL right away, in spite of being 18 years old at the time he was drafted, and still to this point in time, he's only played in 7 of the first 16 games the Kraken have played, in that time averaging just under 7 minutes played per game, which is not a lot. And to add to that, the vast majority of those minutes he has been out on the ice have been pretty sheltered or low consequence minutes. Not to mention the fact it would actually be considerably lower average ice time if you took out the one game in Minnesota where he played nearly 14 minutes. A game in which he was pretty much only in the lineup filling in for injury, and it's also the only game that he got onto either special teams unit. Well, actually, he did play one power play shift in the following game, but that was the only game where he got any significant time on a power play and has yet to play on the kill. So then, given all that, it definitely does seem worth wondering why, if the Kraken don't think that he's fully ready yet for the NHL, which based on the number of games he's played in and amount of time he's played in those games, it does indicate they don't think he's fully ready just yet, why they wouldn't send him down to the AHL or back down to the OHL where he came from. Well, to cover the AHL part of it first, put simply, they can't send him to the AHL because there's an agreement between the NHL and the CHL, which is the governing body that the OHL is a part of, that doesn't allow NHL teams to send OHL players to the AHL. If they're going to send them down, they have to go back to the OHL team that they're still under contract sort of with. There is one small exception to that, but we'll get there in a little bit. The main question that most people are asking when it comes to this situation is that if the Kraken aren't going to be playing Shane Wright in most games, in fact, scratching him so far in most of the games of this season, and even the games he does get into, playing him in those few and pretty sheltered minutes, why they wouldn't just send him back down to the OHL where he is going to play every single game and play big minutes on top of it. Basically, the idea that it's better for him to be playing hockey, even if at a lower level, than not playing hardly any at the higher level. And ultimately, to me at least, this is the main place where I disagree with most of the opinions I've seen out there. Personally, I just don't think there's that much left for Shane to learn or get from playing at the OHL level, even if he's going to be playing significantly more game action. For one thing, he could end up getting hurt in some of that game action, but even putting that aside, I just think that it's better for his development for him to be at the NHL level, even if that's just at this point mostly practicing and just by virtue of being with the team, benefiting from, again, not just NHL coaches and the rest of the staff that goes with that you wouldn't have at the OHL level, but also the NHL players and veteran players, some of whom in that Kraken locker room have been through exactly what Shane is going through right now, like Jordan Eberle or Alex Wennberg, who were both first-round picks themselves and play on the forward end, or even Adam Larson, who was a 4th overall pick himself. Meanwhile, I just don't think he's missing out on that much by not playing at the OHL level right now, other than having more playing time, significantly more, but even at that, those minutes at the OHL level are nowhere near as valuable as the ones he's getting at the NHL level, even if the NHL ones are much fewer and farther between. For one, even if they too, in spite of not having Wright, are having a surprisingly good start to the season, or at least a lot better than most people expected, it's not like the team he came from in the Kingston Frontenacs are by any means a championship contender in the OHL, so unlike what we saw with Beniers going back to Michigan to try to make a run for the NCAA championship, Wright isn't necessarily missing out on a good chance for the same with his old team. And for another thing, on top of the fact that, like we already said, he's pretty much proven everything he needs to at the OHL level, and there's not really that much left for him to learn there, you could still go with that argument of just playing more games at the OHL level is better than not playing them at the NHL level. I mean, if he doesn't play the games, maybe saying that he's going to forget how to play hockey is a bit extreme, but what if his development goes backwards because he's just not playing games? That wouldn't happen if he just played at the OHL level, even if he isn't really going to get better there. Well, as it turns out, due to a situation somewhat unique to him and his age group of prospects, especially those from the OHL, we already know what it looks like for him to miss a complete season of hockey and come back the next year. And that's because after he put up 66 points in 58 games in his first year in the league in 2019-2020, the OHL, due to COVID, shut down entirely for the 2020-2021 season. So Shane didn't get to play any games for a full season, and still bounced back the next year in 21-22 to put up 94 points in 63 games. So he didn't just maintain his status as one of the best players in the league after missing that full season, but actually improved, going from 1.1 points per game in that 1920 season to 1.5 points per game in more games 2 years later, again after that gap year. And sure, you can point out that he scored a few less goals in that season coming off of COVID than the one before, but it wasn't a huge difference, even if it was in a few more games. And again, he still put up way more when it came to assists, with actually almost an assist per game. All of which is to say that if he can miss a full year of OHL action and obviously not be around an NHL team during it and still come back looking like a better player, then no, I don't think he's going to miss another year of OHL action too much, especially when he's going to spend that time around an NHL team and even playing some NHL minutes. Okay, fine, so maybe he is better off at the NHL level, but if that's the case, then why not play him in more games, or at least give him more ice time in the games he does play? And I'll admit, especially when it comes to the ice time in the games he plays, this is where I do have a little bit of frustration, and it seems like there might be some frustration within the people actually involved here. Now, right away, it is worth mentioning that there are some games played benchmarks or milestones worth remembering when it comes to players like Wright who are on their entry-level contract, and especially in the first season of it. The one that we've heard the most about, and we heard about last season with Beniers, is the 9 or 10 game mark, where a player can play 9 games in their first year without having that entry-level contract sort of start. They still get paid for those 9 games, but if they only play 9 games and don't play a 10th one, then the entry-level contract still goes for 3 years starting the next season. Which is why sometimes you'll see, especially towards the end of the season, with teams getting eliminated from the playoffs, they might bring up players that have just signed entry-level contracts to play somewhere around those 9 games to get a taste of NHL action, but not take a year off that entry-level contract. And then other times, like we saw with Beniers last year, you might even see a team bring up a player just to play 10 games and knock that first year off of the contract as kind of a courtesy towards a player that was a high draft pick and ready for immediate NHL action, which we've seen with Beniers he definitely was. So that does open up the option, which is still a possibility considering, again, Wright has only played those 7 games so far this season, that the Kraken are just trying to keep Wright around the NHL team as long as they can before he plays those 9 games, and then they would send him down to the OHL. I will say that I don't think it's terribly likely this is the route that the Kraken are going, considering we already heard at the start of the season when they made the decision to keep him with the NHL squad from Ron Francis that they want to have him with the team the entire season. Now, again, with things changing over time, and especially over the first couple of months of a season, they could have changed their mind since then, and maybe it will still happen. but I don't think it's the most likely route. So then, a couple of other games played benchmarks that might be worth looking out for. One would be 26 games played, at which point this officially becomes Wright's rookie season as far as Calder voting is concerned. Again, this is not one that I think the Kraken are terribly concerned about. Sure, it would be kind of nice for Wright to have a realistic shot at the Calder next season after Beniers hopefully wins it this year, but if he's going to be with the team the whole season, like the Kraken have said, then he's probably going to end up playing more than 26 games, even with missing a chunk of time for something coming up in January that we'll get to here in a bit. And the last benchmark, which the team could be looking at, though I really don't think, again, they're weighing it too heavily when it comes to deciding his playing time, would be 40 games. At which point, if Wright were to play 40 games this season, it's a season that would count towards when he would be eligible to become an unrestricted free agent. A player can become an unrestricted free agent after having played 7 seasons of at least 40 games, or turning 27. So with this season being Wright's age 18 season, if he were to play 40 or more games this year and then all the following years, then he would be eligible without contract to become an unrestricted free agent at the end of his age 24 season rather than age 27. Again, though, I really don't think this is weighing too heavily on the Kraken, considering Wright is definitely the type of player that they're probably going to want to lock up long term after his entry-level contract is done. So when he becomes an unrestricted free agent, probably doesn't matter all that much. But if the plan is to keep him with the team and not send him down after 9 games, then at least at the rate he's going so far, he's not going to reach that 40-game mark this season, especially if they do send him to the World Juniors in late December for a good chunk of January. And since I brought it up, yes, I do think it's very likely, if not a guarantee, that the Kraken will be sending Shane Wright to the World Juniors as a part of Team Canada. It could even be part of why they haven't been leaning on him as a key part of the team so far this season. But since I will say it is clear he isn't quite to the point where Beniers is as a key member of this team and their success to this point in the season, I think it's pretty likely, with this also being the type of experience that a player only gets so many chances to have in their life, that the Kraken will send Wright down there. And again, unlike OHL regular season games, all of these games matter and they are much more intense than an OHL game would be. So from that perspective, Wright will be getting a little bit more of a test than he would be in the OHL. Now, as for the playing time that Wright has gotten in the games that he's gotten into, with the exception of 2, maybe 3 games where he's gotten over 8 minutes of ice time, with 2 of those being the games that he subbed in for McCann on the third line, I just cannot understand why they'll only play him 6 to 6.5 minutes a game, with, again, the exception of those 3. And even in those minutes, they're completely babied minutes, giving him pretty much the lowest leverage situations they can possibly find. Again, I get that they're trying to be competitive and take advantage of a team that looks like, again, it could compete to make a playoff spot, but you got to at least give him chances to get into the game and feel comfortable getting regular shifts out on the ice, and not just putting him out there whenever you feel like he can't hurt the team. Which, while we're on the subject, maybe here it's worth mentioning that I've also seen the argument from some people that playing Wright if he's not ready at the NHL level might hurt his development, because it could hurt his ego if he doesn't think he's good enough for the NHL, and then that'll set him backwards. I'll be honest, in the times that he has been at least available to media, I don't know what goes on behind closed doors, but when he's been available to the media, I don't think there's any issue with Wright not feeling confident at the NHL level. For the most part, he's just seemed like a kid in the candy store, just happy to be a part and be around an NHL team. I'm sure that he'd like to be on the ice a little bit more than he is, which, gotta say, I'm right there with him, but I don't think that there's really much of a chance of him feeling like he doesn't belong if he just isn't playing as well as some of the other guys out on the ice. That aside, again, here though, it's worth mentioning that the games where Wright's looked at his best, especially the last 2 that he played in, which was a while ago now, were the games that he got more ice time and consistent shifts, almost as if having a consistent shift and a consistent place in the lineup was helping him get into the flow of the game and understand his place in the team and that flow. And again, I'm all for them carefully handling this Shane Wright situation and giving him some healthy scratches here and there so he doesn't get overworked at the age of 18 in an NHL lineup, which again is a pretty big ask. But if you're going to put him out on the ice and you're going to try and get him to learn the NHL game, maybe, just maybe, actually having him play the NHL game might help him learn how to do it. Now, in fairness, a couple of the games where Wright didn't get very much playing time, it was partially due to the fact that there were just constant penalties and the game itself, 5-on-5, didn't really have much of a flow. And with him not playing on the power play or penalty kill to this point, outside of when he took McCann's spot in that game against Minnesota, it's somewhat understandable that maybe his playing time would suffer there, and you could see that with his line mates who also didn't play on special teams. But there have been games, especially early on in the first few outings that he had, where he was getting 2 to 3 less minutes of playing time than even his line mates, and that didn't have to do with special teams. And those are the places where I think it's pretty frustrating, and honestly, I don't really understand how that helps his development. And look, I think that we all get that he's not Beniers. For one thing, he's over a year younger than Beniers, and Beniers also came from the NCAA, where he was playing against older competition than what Wright has played against at the OHL level. So it might make sense Beniers was a little bit more ready when he made the jump to the NHL, and also he made that jump at the end of the season rather than at the beginning of his age 18 season. And on top of that, Beniers did prove right away that he belonged in the NHL lineup and could make a difference in it. So I'm not asking for Wright to get the same 14, 15, or 16 minutes of ice time that we saw Beniers get on a top 6 role when he came up to the Kraken at the end of last season. Again, with that being a very different circumstance, with the team being well since eliminated from the playoffs and this year's team being a little bit more competitive. But I do think that Wright should probably be getting more than the 6-ish minutes of ice time that he's been getting when he isn't filling in a third line for an injured player. And it's actually within this part of it, the amount of time he gets on ice in the games he's actually in the lineup for, where it sounds like there could be some frustration within the front office and the people actually involved in this situation directly, where we've seen some differences between what Hackstall is doing and what Ron Francis has said he's ideally looking for. Now, Hackstall has even said, after Wright got the assist in that one game towards the end of a homestand, that he will, I guess, have to get some more ice time for Wright going forward, and then proceeded to scratch him for 4 games in a row not long after that. Meanwhile, Francis has already said that it's been not the start that they were looking for, as he would definitely like to see Wright getting a little bit closer to 10 minutes of time on ice per game. And I'm sure that Francis and Hackstall are very much talking about this on a daily basis, and even a game-to-game basis for sure, about whether or not Wright should be in the lineup based on the matchups and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it's Hackstall's decision of whether or not to put Wright in the lineup, and certainly Hackstall's decision when it comes to when Wright goes out on the ice within the game. Francis isn't down on the bench making those calls, it's Hackstall's call. So while I don't doubt by any means that Francis has had a pretty big hand in how Wright's situation has been handled to this point in the season, especially when it comes to how many games he's been scratched for and how many games he's played in, it is ultimately Hackstall who has that call in the game of how much time he plays on ice, and there could be a bit of a disconnect there, even if they are communicating about it on a daily basis like they've said they have. Also, maybe worth mentioning here that the other 18-year-old from early on in this last year's draft that has played in the NHL in Juraj Slafkovsky, who was the first overall pick that Shane thought he was going to be that pick, has now played in 10 games to Wright 7 and has been getting an average of 10 minutes on ice in those games. Right along where Ron Francis has said he would like to see Shane Wright getting. Maybe not the number of games, but certainly the average time on ice. Now, to be fair to that whole comparison between Slafkovsky and Wright, Slafkovsky was playing in a pro league in Finland before coming over to the NHL this season, where Wright, again, was playing in a junior league in the OHL. Plus, Slafkovsky, while being 18, is a lot bigger than Wright and a little bit more NHL sized. Even at that, though, he hasn't been blowing people out of the water, even with the extra games played and ice time, with just 3 goals in those 10 games and no assists. Still definitely better than what Wright's put out there, but given the extra ice time, it makes sense that he's been able to kind of get into the flow of games a little bit more and find his way onto the score sheet. And of course, recently also managed to get his first NHL suspension with the hit along the boards that got him suspended for 2 games. So yeah, you take the pluses with the minuses, I guess, with a young player and a physical one at that. Even with all that having been said, though, about the amount of time he gets on ice in the games he's actually in the lineup for, still, to me, easily the most frustrating part of this entire situation is which games they actually put him in the lineup for in the first place. Look, again, I get that you want him at the NHL level, learning from NHL coaching and staff, as well as his NHL teammates, again, some of whom veterans have been in the same spot that he's in right now earlier on in their careers. And sure, he might not be fully ready yet to have full-time NHL action, and you want to ease him into that, maybe with a game every other game, or 2 games off, whatever it is. He's not quite ready to jump in like Beniers was. I get it, but I cannot for the life of me understand why they would only give him 2 of the 7 games he's played so far at home. I would think that you'd probably want to play in front of the crowd that's going to support him pretty much no matter what. Again, he's an 18-year-old that we're all very excited to see play for a long time in Seattle. Instead, they've played him for 5 times on the road and 2 at home, and now have scratched him 6 times in a row at home, including the last homestand, all 3 games of that, which his grandparents were in town, I'd imagine, to probably want to see him play in the NHL. And yes, I understand that his grandparents have seen him play hockey before, and while the NHL is different, they're going to have a chance to see him play in the NHL at some point in the future. The point is that another part of this whole situation is that Shane Wright has been on board with it from the beginning, understanding that he might not get as much playing time as some other rookies like Beniers is, but that it's all part of getting him ready to getting his development going in the right direction so that he can have the NHL career that the team would like to see him have. But you would think that if he was directly involved with understanding which games he's going to get scratched and which games he's going to play in ahead of time, he probably wouldn't have his grandparents come into town for a homestand that he knows he's not going to play in. So it does raise some questions about just how involved Wright has been in this whole situation. Even still, though, as far as we've heard, and this includes an interview with Shane's parents after that whole homestand situation, Wright and his whole family are still fully on board with what the Kraken are doing and the direction the Kraken have his career going in, understanding that the NHL is a completely different animal from anything Wright has ever experienced, and even Wright's parents, who I don't know how many NHL games they had been to before, noting just how much faster and harder hitting the NHL was from anything Wright has been in before, with them, having watched their son play his entire career. So as for what we can expect to see from the Kraken and their handling of Shane Wright's career early on in it, which it's still very early on, that is definitely worth mentioning. He's an 18-year-old in his first 20 games with a team in the NHL. It's hard to say exactly what the Kraken are going to do, and it's probably going to vary from game to game and whether or not they feel like Shane is ready for more ice time. And when I say they, there may be differing opinions on that between Wright, Francis, and Hackstall, which is going to be its own thing to watch. But with the team being competitive, if Wright isn't quite yet ready to add to that the way Beniers can, then he might continue to be a kind of every other game type of player. And when I say every other game, more like 2 or 3 games on and then 2 or 3 games off. And even though, as fans, I think we'd all like to see Wright play a little bit more than he has so far to this point, and it's also worth mentioning that understandably the fans seem to get more and more frustrated the more consecutive games that Wright is scratched for in a row, with him already having a streak of 4 in a row that he was scratched for, including that 3-game homestand earlier that his grandparents were in town for. And now, as of filming this, he's been scratched for another 3 home games. It is worth mentioning that the last thing to watch for as far as what the Kraken could do with Wright does have to do with consecutive games being scratched. And that is that there is, in spite of the fact he can't go down to the AHL because of the agreement between the CHL and NHL that we mentioned earlier, there is one exception to that. And that is that if Wright is scratched for 5 games in a row at the NHL level, he can be sent down once to the AHL level for a period of 14 days maximum. So that could be something that the Kraken are looking for here in the late part of November, getting into early December, that they might try to just scratch him here for the next 2 games, get 5 games scratched so that they can send him for that one time to the AHL where he can play for 2 weeks at a little bit of a lower level. And I would assume at that point he would play pretty much every game so they can see him play at a not NHL speed, and then come back to the NHL, maybe play 1 or 2 more games before going to the juniors, and then come back from World Juniors in the back half of the season and see where he's at that point. At this point, who knows what the Kraken will actually do. They may not send him to the AHL, and they might not even send him to the World Juniors, but that does seem like a path that kind of makes sense with the way things are headed right now. Selfishly, especially remembering how exciting it was to see Beniers' first goal in person, I'd love to see Shane Wright score his first goal at home, so maybe playing a few more home games would be kind of nice, and the Kraken do have an extended road trip coming up that they could maybe scratch him for some of those and then get him to the AHL. Either way, we'll just have to see what happens, and again, it's early enough in his career where I think the hot takes of fire Hackstall, fire Francis for the first 20 games of the season, not even 20 games, and not even first 10 games of Shane Wright's NHL career, is a bit overblown. We still got a full season ahead of us, and if by the end of the season, Wright doesn't really look like he's progressed at all, and not much has changed from where we're at right now, then I think we can be asking some serious questions about how they've been handling Wright and what it means for his future. For now, though, it is frustrating, but I think the Kraken are honestly doing a pretty good job of it, all things considered, especially if he isn't quite ready yet for that full-time NHL action. I know there's plenty of you who will disagree with me on that, and you can feel free to let me know about that down in the comments. But at least for now, I think we've pretty much gotten to everything we can as far as the Shane Wright situation right now is concerned. I guess as far as the home games thing, it also would have been kind of nice and fun to see Shane Wright out in the first time with those reverse retro jerseys. Obviously that didn't happen, and maybe it was a good thing considering how violent that game turned out to be at times. Still, let me know what you think of this whole situation down in the comment section. I think we've pretty much covered everything we can, so I guess if I left something out, let me know. But if you've made it to this point, I think this one's gotten longer than I expected it to be, so if you've made it here, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I appreciate you using them. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.